Hi, I'm Gabriela Houston. I'm a Polish UK-based author of Slavic-inspired novels for adults and children. Welcome to my channel where we discuss storytelling in all its forms. It's my belief that storytelling is an intrinsic part of everyone's life, as well as an important part of many professions. On the show, I talk to writers, artists, journalists, researchers, and more about how they use storytelling in their jobs and life. Every other week, there's something different, so click like and subscribe for more. It really helps the channel. Today's guest is Dr. Tom Bellamy. Dr. Bellamy is an academic neuroscientist and Associate Professor of Pharmacology at the University of Nottingham. He was awarded a PhD in neuroscience from University College London in 2001 and held a personal fellowship at the Babraham Institute in Cambridge, 2004 to 2010. He's fascinated by the complex relationship between fundamental neurophysiology and human behavior. His first book, SMITTEN, Romantic Obsession, The Neuroscience of Limerence, and How to Make Love Last, will be published in spring 2025, in April, I believe. So thank you so much for coming on the show.
My pleasure. Great to be with you.
I really enjoyed your book. I thought it was a really interesting topic, and I thought you had a very cool angle that we're going to discuss at length. But can you first describe to us what limerence is and how is it different to love?
Sure. So limerence is, I suppose, a form of love. It's always difficult when talking about love to come up with good definitions that everybody agrees on. So, I mean, the ancient Greeks had 7 or 8 different forms of love. And I think all of us recognize this, that we have, love for family, love for children, love for our romantic partners, and it takes different forms. Limerence specifically is an altered state of mind. So it's a form of intense romantic infatuation with another person. And about half the population experience this in the early stages of love. So they get very intensely, obsessively infatuated with another person. And so often when talking about limerence and trying to describe its symptoms, which are things like, a sense of euphoria and exhilaration when you're with that other person, and the presence of intrusive thoughts and romantic daydreams that seem kind of wonderful at first, but as they go on, they can become quite intrusive and hard to ignore and difficult makes it difficult to concentrate and things like that. So you can kind of talk around the symptoms of this state of mind of infatuation. And probably half the people will say, well, that's just love. You don't need a special word for that. And the other half of the people will say, that sounds a bit neurotic. That isn't, what a healthy adult should be experiencing in love. And I think really that is why the concept of limerence is useful, because only about half of people who in the early stages of love fall into that infatuation would experience it. So whenever if you're dating, if you're kind of meeting somebody for the first time and falling in love, there's about a 50-50 chance that that other person also experiences limerence, and so will go through those same processes in the early stage of love as you. And there's about a 50% chance that they won't. And so they won't be experiencing that. And so they'll have very different expectations about what love is like and how love should progress and how people in love should behave.
Why do you think that some people are more likely to experience limerence or be limerent than others?
So, I mean, it's a good question without a clear answer, unfortunately. So limerence hasn't been specifically researched very much. So, as a concept, it was first introduced in the late 1970s by a professor called Dorothy Tenoff. So, she was a psychologist, and she was a sort of human behavioral psychologist. So, she was gathering testimony from people that were going through intense love, particularly heartache. So if they were struggling with love. And so she was gathering this all together and trying to find common elements for the experience of love thinking that she was identifying a universal experience. So there's this idea of human universals, which are kind of emotions or behaviors that we all experience. And that's what she was trying to do with love. But what she came to realize is that not everybody does have that experience. Not everybody does go through those same processes. But her idea, whilst it really resonated with a lot of people that read the book, where she first laid out what limerence is, it didn't really catch on with the profession in psychology. And, my guess for why that is because she was working in around about the same time that attachment theory was really beginning to take off. And that attachment theory was far more influential as a way of understanding bonding and a way of understanding the early processes of love and the neuroscience of love.
Or theorizing bonding, I think, isn't it?
What? Sorry?
Maybe theorizing bonding.
Yes. Yeah. And so I think her ideas weren't so influential, didn't catch on, and so they kind of stayed on the periphery to an extent of psychology. And so there isn't a lot of direct research into what causes limerence, how it can develop, what might be the factors that influence it. We can reasonably speculate about it. To kind of give a quick summary overall, it's partly going to be genetic and it's partly going to be environmental. And so it's likely to be your own kind of, if you like, inherent tendencies as an individual person with, all the different personality traits that we have and the early life experiences that you go through with bonding with your parents. And then the formative romantic experiences that we have going through puberty and adolescence. And so, the role models that are around in the environment and the experiences that you have during those kind of critical formative stages will shape whether or not you have this tendency to go into limerence in the early stages of love.
In the book, you describe, you quote some of your test subjects and some of the other people's test subjects who discuss their own experiences with it. And there were a few people who mentioned that, they felt like most of their life had been just like great and they were going through life on autopilot almost. And then they had this euphoria and sudden burst of emotions when they found this person that woke up all those feelings in them. So just throwing it in there, do you think it's possible that people who are non-limerents are just people who haven't found their limerence object yet?
Yep, that is possible. So one way I think is useful to think about limerence is by an analogy to kind of other emotional states. So something like anxiety. Everybody experiences anxiety. Anxiety is useful. It's adaptive. We need it to be able to recognize threats and avoid, danger. So everybody knows what anxiety is like, but you can get into situations in life where the anxiety has been chronic for such a long time, or if it's not focused on a sort of a specific event, like a specific danger or a specific threat, it becomes generalized and you just go into a state of anxiety that would, reach the stage of being sort of an anxiety disorder where your anxiety is dysfunctional. It's not being well managed. So some people will have a tendency inherently to be prone to anxiety. Some people, even if they're not prone to anxiety generally, can find themselves in life circumstances where they get driven into that state. And I think limerence is rather like that some people, it's just the way they experience love, that every time that they feel like they've fallen in love, they've really fallen head over heels and they get that euphoria and that exhilaration and it feels like the world is in color, things are brighter, love songs are more meaningful and deep, and everything about the world, it really does, it can lead to a whole increase in overall arousal, and that genuinely does make your brain operate in a different mode. Your thoughts
Mm.
are racing faster, and you are making connections and seeing things that you wouldn't ordinarily notice, and probably overdoing it and seeing things that perhaps aren't really there but seem to have extra significance for you. And so some people will have that tendency, but there will be other people that don't generally experience that, but they might meet a particular person who behaves in a particular way that drives them into a state of limerence. And there are some things that people can do that are more likely to provoke limerence in somebody else. So if they have an attraction to this person, the way that they behave can make it much more likely that limerence sets in.
Mm. So have we identified, I say royal we, has one, so have you identified like a particular triggers that can make someone an object of someone's limerence? Are those very individual, or have you found common themes?
Yeah, so I think you can look at it at two levels. So there's the person that's going through the limerence, and then there's the behavior of the person that they're infatuated with. They're what's called their limerent object. And that's a term that Dorothy Tenoff used very deliberately. It sounds
Mm.
bad to call somebody an object, but it's to kind of capture that psychologically important idea that limerents aren't actually seeing this other person clearly. They are raising them into a fantasy and projecting their romantic needs and their romantic ideals onto this other person. So to an extent, they are objectifying them. They're not treating them like a real person. So for the limerent, it will be very personal. It will be all about your own life experience and your own romantic sensibilities, if you like, that determine what it is that triggers that limerent excitement, what I call the glimmer of limerent recognition in a particular person. There are some common things like eye contact is a very potent stimulus for triggering limerence. So lots of people that come to my site at livingwithlimerence.com talk about it was when I noticed that he was looking at me, or she held eye contact for longer than was normal, and that was it. I was captured. I was seduced. But for other people, it can be really idiosyncratic. It can be about their appearance. So blonde hair, blue eyes, brown hair, dark eyes. It can be scent. Scent is an extremely powerful stimulus, actually, which we're not always really aware of. It can be personality traits, like a dry sense of humor or something like that. Unfortunately, it can sometimes be kind of rather destructive triggers, like unavailable people or married people, or people that
Mm.
treat the limerent badly. And so they're somehow drawn to people that are avoidant or offhand with them. When it comes to the behavior of the limerent object, the main triggers are going to be if they don't behave in a way that makes it clear how they feel. So it's if they're giving mixed
So
messages,
that strengthens
that
the
strengthens
feeling
the
of
limerent.
limerence in
Yeah,
the limerent.
yeah. Is
Yeah, okay.
if the limerent object is behaving in a way that makes it hard to figure out how they really feel
Mhm.
about the limerent, because there's sort of two strong drives that amplify limerence. That's hope, so feeling that there's some chance that there may be a romantic connection here, that this other person is attracted to you as well. So there's got to be some kind of glimmer of hope, but then combined with uncertainty where you can't find out. So that might be just that the limerent themselves are a bit indecisive, and so they don't really want to reveal their feelings, and they're kind of dancing around it a little bit, and so they don't come out openly and say, well, look, I have romantic feelings for you. What do you think? And so they're trying to kind of keep their cards close to their chest, and so they're not revealing themselves. Or if the limerent object gives them mixed messages, so sometimes they're really warm and they're like, "Oh, it's wonderful to see you," and they seem very upbeat. But then other times they're cold, or if they say confusing things like, "Oh, I do really like you, but my life's very complicated at the moment," or things like this that give hope but combine it with uncertainty. And that is very psychologically powerful, because you can't resolve the situation, and so the limerence tends to kind of go inwards, and it makes the limerent ruminate more about, well, how did they behave the last time I saw them? What could I have said that would have been different? And there's some hints here that they're interested in me, but other times they don't seem to be into me. And so the combination of both the limerent's own vulnerabilities and the dynamic of their relationship with their limerent object, both working together, can really drive limerence into a crazy state.
I mean, the threshold, I imagine that the threshold for what is considered to be the confirmation of hope, is very different for different people, especially when someone is already prone to idealize a person in situations in such a way. Because so one scenario you described is like when someone says, well, I'm in the kind of place in my life where I'm not really looking for it, you're very nice, like that. To me, instantly, that sounds like, they're just letting them down. That they're letting them down gently, right? They're just being nice and just saying politely, scoot off, Whereas for someone who has already attached all of those emotions to the person, that might be read in a different way, isn't it?
Absolutely. And they wouldn't hear it as clearly. And I mean, another thing about limerence being an altered state of mind, you're not really thinking clearly, and your judgment is impaired. And even if you have, an experience like that I think most people would recognize, that's just a polite no. It's not really an invitation to keep trying. It can be misread. And as time goes on, afterwards, on reflection and ruminating by themselves, the limerent can easily turn it around and think, well, actually, maybe I did misunderstand it. And I even hear from people who, on the site, they get in touch and they say, I actually did disclose to my limerent object my feelings, and they told me no, and I felt better in the short term, but then I needed to check in again just to see if things had changed, and if maybe they changed their mind, or maybe I've misunderstood it, or maybe I hadn't made myself clear. And so there's that there is a lot of variation, as you say, in how much it takes for any individual person to still be able to feel hope. That
I think
sometimes it can border on the delusional.
I think I remember, Malcolm Gladwell wrote in Talking to Strangers about how bad we are actually at reading the signals that other people are sending us, and reading their body language, and how opaque our own inner life is to other people. And we are so resistant to accepting that in general, that we sort of want to feel that sense of connection. And you write a lot about how limerence is an urge to bond, and sort of the sense that, like, here is a real strong connection that I might develop with another person. Can you talk about that a little bit? Because this is like potential with a stranger, as opposed to perhaps people who have been in their lives for a long time and know us better.
Yeah, I mean, again, that is absolutely true about misreading nonverbal cues. And again, to just go back to the eye contact thing, there's another scenario where you can project an awful lot of meaning onto prolonged eye contact that could be a complete misreading of the situation. And so it is, fraught with opportunities for misunderstanding. So, certainly it's recognizing how you can clearly communicate with another person to be sure, if you like, what they're really feeling and what they're really saying is an incredibly valuable step forwards in understanding your own limerence and your own kind of romantic life and your own romantic experiences. Because exactly like you say, many people would recognize a polite no and would see, well, okay, what they're doing is they're trying to let me down gently. And again, it's a natural impulse. It's a compassionate impulse to think, well, if you're friends with this person and they've come and they've said, oh, I'm interested in you, or I'm attracted to you. You don't want to say, well, I'm not attracted to you and I don't want to be your friend anymore. Please go away. That's awful. And so, the compassionate instinct there would be to just say something like that, like, oh, well, no, I'm not looking for a relationship at the moment, or my life is complicated, or I don't see you that way, I see you as a friend, or I really care for you, but I don't see you that way. So all of that is completely reasonable, of course, and how most people would react to finding out that maybe their friend had developed romantic feelings for them. But it is the kind of thing that actually reinforces the limerence, because it isn't a clear no or a clear yes, which are the ways of communicating, if you like, that would help resolve any uncertainty around it. So this is why it's so difficult, I think, to get out of a limerence episode if you're deep into the infatuation, and it's hard to get clear communication working effectively with another person. If it's a stranger, if it's somebody that you don't really know very well, then of course you don't know anything about the way that they generally communicate anyway, and you haven't built any kind of rapport with them. If it's somebody that you know better, then possibly there's more hope for navigating through that and communicating in a way that works for everybody. But I'd say that, if, as a sort of general advice, if you do have the experience of that you think somebody is becoming limerent for you, that trying to find a compassionate way of saying it, but an absolutely clear way of saying, I am not interested in a romantic relationship with you, is the best way of helping a friend who has fallen into limerence with you to get out of that limerence.
I think it's very difficult, though, to judge, because you describe limerence as like, so one of the aspects of limerence that you describe as present almost always is a sense of, like, maybe not shame, but like this guilty hiding of the extent of the obsession, of the romantic obsession that someone that they might have with object of their desire. But the thing is that if they don't express the extent of it, it's very hard from the other side to actually tell it apart, isn't it? Like, how do you, as a limerence object, for example, how would you see and tell the difference between someone just being attracted to you and like testing the waters versus them having developed limerence towards you?
Yeah, I guess it depends on how good the limerent is at hiding their internal state. Generally speaking, limerents are bad at it. The feelings are so strong, the feelings are so overwhelming that there's inevitable tells. So there are things that kind of give it away. So a real kind of emotional volatility. So, kind of brittleness, that if you're if you say something, maybe joking, bantering or something like that, if they take it very personally, if they get really hurt, if they get very excited, but then very upset with you, if in the course of a friendship, you're doing things that you would think with any of your other friends, it would have been neutral, but maybe they get offended that they weren't included in something, things like that. So it's looking for signs that the person, if they are your friend, is going through big emotional ups and downs over things that to you seem relatively neutral, that they don't seem as though they should have that much emotional significance for a friend. So getting very excited about spending time with you, things like that, you can often see it in their eyes because they're so euphoric and elated.
I mean, if you're like at a stage of having potential interest in someone, right? Then like them being excited about seeing you, it's like I would see it as a base minimum expectation,
sure.
isn't it? Like if they don't get
Yeah,
excited to see you, what's the point?
yeah. Well, it's about degree, really. It's about the intensity of it. And again, I think this is a difference between limerence and non-limerence. That non-limerence, it's not as if they don't get the excitement of early love and they don't have the thrills and the exhilaration and things like that, but it's not so all-encompassing. It's not so intense, extreme, disruptive. From the perspective of neuroscience, a very good way of describing limerence is addiction to another person. So it literally is um, the same pathways within the brain, the reward system, the arousal system, and the pleasure centers that are activated by, drugs of abuse, drugs that people become addicted to. And limerence is like a kind of a supernormal reward, that it's so powerful, it's so strong, that it does, take over the limerence life. So Tenoff had a list of about 20 symptoms that she used to define, limerence as an experience. And it was things like, this elation and exhilaration, the presence of intrusive thoughts that are difficult to turn off, even when you don't want to have them, that pain in the chest, the kind of tightness in the chest around the heart when you're with them, the, over arousal, like, as though your sympathetic nervous system, your fight or flight response has been activated and pupils dilate, your palms sweat, you feel tingly and overexcited. So there's a whole series of symptoms like that show that you've moved into a different state physiologically. But then as time goes on, if the limerence isn't resolved, so if you're not communicating clearly, and so you're not able to get a clear yes or a clear no, and you stay in that state of uncertainty, it can progress into a fixation and then essentially an addiction, where you just have a relentless, irresistible wanting to be with that other person, to bond with that other person, that you can't concentrate on other tasks anymore because this is your singular focus. And it can easily get to the point where you're not even sure you want to be with them, but you can't stop thinking about them, and you can't stop that drive to try and bond, to think, well, could I recover this? Could I get back to what used to feel so thrilling and exciting and exhilarating, but now just feels exhausting and debilitating and negative? So you can get into that state of person addiction where you're not able to easily break out of those obsessive thoughts and that compulsive behavior.
I think in kind of anthropological terms, it kind of makes sense in a way for us to have developed this, because in a way, like the like success of life often, or happy, not success, like happiness in life, like the biggest decision that anybody ever makes, right, is the choice of a partner in life. Like that decision will make or break a life.
Yeah.
And so in a sense, it makes it, so it makes perfect sense, I feel like, for your whole body to place this much weight on the choice of object of your affection. But what about when limerence becomes sort of pathological? So when there's no, I imagine if there's reciprocation, then there is less sort of unless there's like a third party involved, like when there's
Yeah.
reciprocation, that's different. But what about when limerence becomes pathological? So when there's no hope of reciprocation and you have
Yeah.
perhaps stalking situation or kind of other.
So yeah, definitely again, to go back to the analogy with anxiety, there are definitely times where you can get driven into a state where you've been limerent for so long that you've essentially become addicted to the person, and it is just a negative experience, and it's pathological thoughts and habits that are very difficult to break out of, and it's irrational and it's involuntary, and so it does just feel like a burden. Now, there are things that can be done to help with that, which is a big topic that we could maybe come to later on. But from a biological perspective, it does all make sense. Like you say, the drive to form a pair bond is obviously going to be beneficial. I mean, if you think about us as animals, as organisms, survival and reproduction are the two big things that evolution cares about, and that our genes care about. And so obviously limerence is linked into reproduction, that forming a strong pair bond is a very effective reproductive strategy. And if you look at the anthropological literature and the sort of prevalence of social monogamy, in all different societies, it fits this pattern where forming a pair bond gives the individuals what can be called fitness interdependence, where the chance of their offspring, or the chance of conceiving offspring, and then raising the offspring, providing all the resources and all the security and the safety through the most vulnerable period of life, is very good. It's very effective way of propagating your genes into the future. This is a very scientific perspective on love, but let's run with it. So that definitely works, but also in that same scenario, it's a big commitment. So both individuals forming a very tight monogamous pair bond are thereby excluding any other potential mates. And so that is a commitment that can be gamed. And so, again, if you look in terms of the sort of evolutionary literature on this, one of the kind of stable situations within a population is social monogamy, but with opportunistic infidelity as a way of also maximizing gene propagation. So if you like, the most stable arrangement would be to have a population with some limerence who form very tight pair bonds and some non-limerence who don't form very tight pair bonds, but have some, if you like, maybe have more flexibility. And everybody would benefit, any individual would benefit from the limerence, very powerful, strong pair bonds, because they know they've got, commitment from that individual. But equally, not everybody has to be limerent within a population for that to be. There isn't one most successful reproductive strategy. Basically,
Yes.
there
I
can be
mean,
more than one method that works and that persists because it's stable and it's successful. And that's why I suspect that there is a pretty good balance between limerence and non-limerence, because both of the strategies work.
yes. I mean, I have read there's now theories in archaeology and anthropology that humans have in fact evolved to exist in matriarchal societal structures where men used to in early societies exist kind of on the periphery, and women would form much more short-lived relationships and then raise the children within their matriarchal group. And there's been some recent studies that I wanted to ask you about. So there's been recent studies that women's brains make during their hormonal cycle make them attracted to different type of men. So there's been a study that showed that during ovulation time, women are attracted to men with a lot more kind of features that suggest high testosterone level, versus in the rest of their cycle, they're attracted to pretty much the opposite. Of course, there's like baseline is different for different people, but so have you come across any of the sort of patients or, you know, people who sought treatment for limerence, who found themselves limerent during different parts of their cycle, hormonal cycle, and they just felt like this compulsion, maybe not even to the same person?
Yeah, so certainly I've heard from a number of women who say that their symptoms of limerence vary with their cycle. So the intensity of the feeling of the limerent desire, they recognize it, you know, following their cycle. And so that would make sense, you know, in the sense that there is going to be a hormonal component to limerence. And in terms of the neuroscience of it, that we do have, there's going to be a contribution in the bonding system from hormones. And so that will, you know, certainly be a factor. I have heard about these studies of how attractiveness of different, you know, face shapes, and, you know, the how deep the voice is for an individual man, things like that, how that varies. Attraction to those traits does vary with ovulation. I think it's, if there is an effect, there probably is an effect, but it's quite weak. And it's one of those things where there's an awful lot of noise, if you like. There's you know, confusing the signal, so that it's likely that there's as much variation within the population as there is for any individual person going through their cycle. And so it's hard to, I think, draw strong conclusions about that. It would fit into this idea that we're kind of built for monogamy plus opportunistic mating, that it might be that at points in the menstrual cycle, you know, during ovulation, that trying to secure, if you like, the most masculine genes would be more of a priority. Whereas at other points in the cycle, or certainly when you've got a child and you're nursing and you've got Anna Maria, you wouldn't be looking for a hyper-masculine mate, that you would be looking for stability and security and support. So, yeah, you know, it makes sense. There's always a danger with this, that to an extent it's a just so story, that you're trying to fit facts to the idea already that you're making. And many of these studies are kind of, the evidence isn't that strong, and there's other studies that contradict it, and it's very dependent on the conditions that the experiment was carried out in, and it's often not reproducible. So this is a big problem in psychology, that you have what's been termed a reproducibility crisis, that what seemed like stable phenomena turn out to not last, you know, and then not be broadly applicable, you know, to general populations. So
I think there's a lot of worry in general that like psychology and psychiatry are kind of like house of cards a little bit, that every now and again you see that like, oh, we have put those three distinct diseases under one umbrella term and try to treat it in the same way. So
sure.
so
I mean,
that is very
in the defense of
difficult.
psychology, they're trying to deal with the most complicated thing that we know exists in the universe,
Absolutely.
which is
And
the human brain. So
and I absolutely, you know, respect that. I think it's a very it's a mammoth task to try and kind of unwind all those different aspects.
So I mean, my own career, my research career, I've always focused at the level of the neurochemistry, you know, the neurotransmitters, and how do the cells signal, and how are signals coded into the sort of the information processing aspect of the brain. Because, you know, for this reason, that that feels tractable to me. It feels like you can make sense
Yeah,
of
this part
cells and
lights up.
molecules
Yeah,
once
it's
you
like
get up
tick.
to behavior and the reason why people do what they do.
Mm.
It becomes very challenging. But also that, I think, is why one of the reasons that limerence is such a fascinating topic, because it does seem as though there is a good route from understanding, the fundamental operation of the reward system and the bonding system and the arousal system to these higher level experiences, like becoming essentially addicted to another person, that you can predict based on the way that those basic neural systems operate, that people would become fixated and would want to form that intense pair bond with another person. So I like the fact that it feels like one of those things that you can go from the basic mechanics of the brain up to people's experience, their lived experience, as they say, in a
Yes.
situation and experience as important as love.
I mean, I have to say, I was really happy when I was, because I'm interested in everything on like a base level, but I was slightly worried that the book would be quite dry, neurons this, synapses that.
Yeah.
And so I was very pleasantly surprised that it seems to straddle, anthropology and sociology and psychology as well. And that made me kind of interested in like landing on this research subject. You mentioned in the book that there's a real controversy of studying love in, hard sciences. Why is that?
I think it's probably just, it seems a bit frivolous, that, the sciences have moved always in the direction of, getting closer to physics, trying to drill down to the point of explaining things in terms of first principles and even, maths. And again, that was where I was largely operating as a scientist, was, trying to understand the computational rules of the brain and understand thinking in those terms. Whereas, the behavior of people that's not very reliable, that's not easy to reproduce, and is subject to all of these factors that you can't control, that you can't constrain, it makes it much harder. And so it does tend to be something that I think more conventional academics would steer away from, because they'd think, well, I can't really, carry out controlled experiments on this, and it's a
Too many
topic.
variants, yeah.
Yeah, and it's a topic that seems like, well, that's something for love stories, and that's for the philosophers and the poets, and so maybe there's that element of it. I'm not sure, but I think it's probably that. It's that it's not like a nice meaty mathematical experimental science, and so it doesn't attract the people that think that that's the way to answer questions.
So you've mentioned, just as a thought experiment for me, for my pleasure, since you mentioned the difficulties around like studying the subject of limerence, if you could design the perfect experiment, ethics be damned,
Right.
right? What would that experiment look like for limerence?
So I suppose the most obvious thing would be if we could get people, run a survey, and sort them into limerence and non-limerence, if that really is a meaningful category difference. And I do think it is, but you can make an argument about, well, actually, is limerence more on a spectrum? And there's some people that are very limerent and some people that are only weakly limerent, and that trying to say it's one or the other is, you're just putting a dividing line somewhere along that too, and say anybody above this line, they're a limerent, anybody below this line, they're a non-limerent. But if we could do that and find people at the two ends of it, and then put them, in an MRI machine, and look for the activation of, the key neural systems when you say show them a picture of their limerent object, or show them the picture of a stranger. And there have been some studies along those lines. So Helen Fisher was involved in trying to do this, essentially putting people into an MRI scanner and then showing them pictures of their loved ones and looking for which areas of the brain lit up. And that did give what you would predict, that yes, the reward systems light up, and yes, the centers. So within the brainstem, there's an area called the ventral tegmental area, which is where your dopamine neurons are clustered, and that was firing, nicely when people were seeing their limerent object rather than seeing a stranger. So at that basic level, it has been established, yes, love is rewarding, but I don't think that's a revelation to many people. But it would be, if you could get to the stage of seeing, well, what's the intensity of it? What is there a difference in the connectivity and the strength of connection in limerence compared to non-limerence? I would also be interested in doing cognitive tests. So you could run a battery of cognitive tests on somebody that was in a state of limerence compared to not in a state of limerence and see how they perform. And I don't know what it would be, because you would maybe predict from arousal that their cognitive performance would be enhanced. So this is your thoughts are fizzing and the world seems very colorful and exciting and everything. But from another perspective, the distractibility means that maybe they would actually have a lot of difficulty focusing on a task, a cognitively demanding task, because their thoughts would be constantly going back to the limerent object. So there's things like that I would love to do, and try and find out, again, is it possible to identify from neuroscience or physiological markers that somebody is in this altered mental state, and that is a stable state that can be determined and recognized and measured somehow. That would be nice. That would settle a lot of questions along the lines of, is limerence really a separate physiological state, or is it is it an experience at the human level, but it can't be disentangled experimentally from other sources of arousal or other states.
Or that this particular bit of jelly in the brain is sticks out this way in the limerence or something. That's very nice to see, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, a surprising amount of human neuroscience is that it's sometimes called blobology, where you essentially run MRI scans and just see where are the blobs of activity. and say this blob is bigger, that blob, and again, even sort of at the terms of neuroanatomy, you can identify regions of the brain where there's a greater density of gray matter or a greater density of white matter. And so a lot of studies into, say, depression or schizophrenia or other like bipolar disorder, things like this, there will be scrutiny of the brain, which regions of the brain are operating differently, which are there any anatomical clues about what parts of the brain are involved in this particular phenomenon. So that is a kind of a rich area of research, and it's one of the things that the limitations of studying people is that you are kind of only able to look with these non-invasive techniques. Obviously, the real kind of experimental psychologists will get into animal experiments where they'll actually manipulate animals and try to understand from that kind of interventional experiment what the different regions of the brain do, and then extrapolate from that up to people.
Yes,
which doesn't always work out.
I was wondering about the obsessive element of it, because that is something I think where up until that point, people think, well, that is just being really truly in love. That's the stuff that poems and art is made of, right? So I think the really interesting point is, when do we pathologize it? What's the cutoff point where at which point we say this is an addiction, this is something we should be treating?
So the broad answer to that is what I think a lot of psychologists and psychiatrists and therapists would say is, if a behavior or a habit or the use of a substance or whatever has got to the point where it becomes involuntary and it's having a significant negative effect on your life and your quality of life, and you don't feel able to manage it anymore, and it's causing distress, that is then in the realm of an unhealthy behavior that needs treatment, that needs some kind of support to manage it effectively. That is distinct from a formal diagnosis. So there are some disorders that are recognized, and there's these kind of authoritative texts. So the WHO has a set of guidelines, and in the US there's what's called the DSM, so the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, that lists, these are recognized by a plurality of psychiatric professionals as disorders that are seen in multiple people, and they have the same symptoms, and they're non-overlapping with other mental health concerns. So limerence,
I think I much prefer your your way of defining it, which is like, if it needs treatment, if it's causing you trouble, then
if it's causing you pain.
And,
pragmatically, if you're wanting to help somebody, that's the starting point. You don't say, "Oh, I'm afraid this isn't listed in the DSM, so I can't help you." So limerence is not listed in any of these authoritative texts, and in fact, there aren't many behavioral addictions at all. So things that we generally would recognize in our daily lives as problematic. So things like overuse of social media, or overuse of pornography, or shopping addiction, or sex addiction, or things like this. Even things like Asperger's syndrome are not listed in these texts. And so the only behavioral addiction that has got a sufficient clinical evidence base for it to have got listed is gambling addiction, where again, it's very easy to identify when it's gone too far, when you're no longer in control of your behavior, when it's having a clear detrimental effect on your own life and your family's life, because if you're gambling away all of your family's resources, that obviously is a serious matter.
That's the issue with it, like, just looking at the list, isn't it? Because the other ones, like all the therapists,
we can all see like, that it must be the same
a disorder,
but until
it's hard to,
and until there is enough evidence and there is enough research done to establish that it is clearly a separate condition that isn't described, isn't just comorbidity with other conditions and things like that, there's a reluctance to give a formal definition of these things. But pragmatically, in daily life, when a habit or a behavior
become a problem.
is having a problem, it has become a problem. And in fact, for limerence, so I ran a survey from the site where I got a marketing firm actually to poll people in the general population, because I was very worried about the fact that everybody that's coming to my site is looking for support with limerence. So they've already obviously self-selected that they are experiencing this form of love, this form of kind of obsessive love. So I got a marketing firm to just send it out cold to people, giving a definition of limerence, as concise a definition as I could come up with, and saying, have you ever experienced this condition? And that's where I get this number of about half, because it was actually in the survey a little bit over 60% of people that said yes, that they had experienced it. But if you look at the numbers and you do the kind of statistical analysis, I think there's reasons to think that's slightly higher than the real number in the general population. But I asked a secondary question, which was, has this experience ever been so bad that it's prevented you from enjoying your life? I can't remember the exact phrasing, but it was along those lines. And only half of the people that said, yes, I've experienced limerence, said, yes, it has had a detrimental effect on my life, that it caused distress. So again, it fits in this idea. Some people will be able to manage those symptoms. In some scenarios, the limerence will resolve itself naturally because either the other person reciprocates and you have a relationship, or there's a clear no and you are able to move on with closure. But in about 50% of the cases, that doesn't happen, and people get into that late stage of limerence that feels like addiction to another person.
Have you followed up with asking about whether those who have experienced the negative effects of limerence, if it was caused by lack of reciprocation?
I didn't. No, I didn't ask the reasons why.
Yeah,
I was
maybe that's where the lack of ethics comes in.
Well,
because I would probe.
This was a high level survey. I just wanted to
Yes.
get, because there were so many conflicting estimates of how common limerence was. And again, often if you look at it from the perspective of the people seeking support, that's going to be a fraction of all of the people that have distress, and that will be a fraction of all of the people that can experience limerence. And so I was,
you just
previously,
wanted broad strokes for that
so
approach,
clinical estimates have put it at about 5% of the population. But just anecdotally talking to people, in my life, intrusively, saying, have you ever experienced this thing? About half of the people that I talked to about limerence said, oh yeah, that's love, isn't it? And so to me, it seemed likely that it was more common than that estimate. But then if you do limit it to say, well, actually, we're going to define limerence as only being those cases where it gets really severe to the point where it's involuntary and to the point where it feels like an addiction and it's really disrupting your life and having a negative impact on it and holding you back, then yes, it would be a much smaller percentage of people. So
you describe this as this limerence as also like a form of idealization of a person. So you put them on a pedestal, they're just so much above you, but it's linked with this very strong bonding desire. And I was wondering how that sense of this like limerence object being so high, so placed so high, it's so this such an ideal versus me down here. How does this work with the bonding desire? Do you think it's external validation, or is it more about like creating a longevity of a bond? Like, how does this disparity of perceived value of the limerence object and myself work in terms of the bonding desires?
That's an interesting question. I've never really looked at it like that. So it's definitely true that people idealize and idolize their limerent object. I hadn't thought of it in the context that then that makes you feel small or not worthy. I mean, I definitely heard that from many people suffering from limerence, that they feel they're not good enough and they could never aspire to be with this person. And so again, it's one of those situations where your own personal experience of limerence is going to be tied up into your own self-perception. So if self-esteem is low, then you're going to assume that this person, this exemplar, is completely out of your range, out of your league. I think it's more that the person just becomes the ideal romantic, or the romantic ideal, that nobody could be more desirable than them. They are, almost infinitely desirable. And often it isn't that the limerent is not able to see the flaws in their limerent object. They see them, they just don't care. It's like it doesn't register with them. That if their limerent object is I don't know, rude to other people, or has bad habits or bad personal hygiene, or whatever it would be, that you would see that this is okay. That's not great. It isn't that the limerent can't see those flaws; it's that they don't care, because the value of the limerent object in their eyes is so high that anything's forgivable. Anything could be rationalized away, or it can even be turned into something endearing. One of the comments that really stuck with me was somebody. It is in the book, so it's one of the comments that made it in. That they said their limerent object, she was so ordinary and boring that other people didn't really see her, but that just made her so endearing to them that other people couldn't see her value. Like the
Oh, I
limerent
see so many
was
red
able
flags in
to,
it. That sends a chill,
yeah,
actually.
well, we could psychoanalyze that person, but I almost felt it probably says something about me. I felt that was very endearing for the limerent, that they were drawn to the ordinariness of their limerent object and found it wonderful that they alone were able to see the infinite value of this apparently completely ordinary woman, but that for whatever reason met the criteria for that limerent to become this romantic ideal.
Yeah. Would you think so? I was talking with some people about, like, just discussing a book, and I was just talking about running through the people we know in everyday life, and just like identifying, like, oh, this person's approach to romance seems like a complete opposite of limerence, because they're so cautious, and they're so, and the other person is trying to push for like more commitment early on, and they want to wait, they want to, and then they like slowly, and it's not that they are I don't know, it's not even that they're trying to play the field or anything sinister at all. It's more that their attachment doesn't, spark up and like, take over their life. It's more of a kind of gradual thing. And then there's other, and I was wondering actually about how the dating world's changed. Like, a lot of people who are maybe re-entering the dating world often comment that 15 years ago, 20 years ago, when you met people maybe in a bar and your eyes would meet, and there would be a spark of recognition, and you would like, spark of attraction.
Yeah.
And that's how you would spark up conversation. And now, people call the police if you approach that. And so you have to first approach them over the internet, over the apps, and which also it does something to our brains. I'm convinced. I mean, obviously you might have studied it, I have not, but from casual observation, it does something to a person. How do you think that sits with limerence?
I think it makes it worse. So there's two big factors are going to be the moment of first contact. And so if that is on an app with a picture and a little bit of sales patter of, here's my best attempt,
and sometimes a fish
track. Oh yeah. Well, a tiger or something. Yeah. All the classics. But that's it. You're trying to make an assessment on the basis of a photo and some, a brief biography as to whether you're going to swipe and so on. And that is profoundly different to being in front of somebody and getting to know them a little bit. And like you say, having the eye contact, having the body language and the scent and the way they interact with other people and their sense of humor and all of that. So it used to be that first contact would be in a social setting, and that it would be also often, not always, but often, within your existing social group, so that often people would go out with their friends and then maybe meet other people in the bar or in the coffee shop or whatever. But it would be either kind of you were meeting these people within the social context of your existing friendship group, or even that it was people within your social network, your local social network, that you were becoming attracted to. And so that is a very profound change, that it used to be social and it used to be something that was already within the sphere of the people that knew you. Now people operate on the apps and they tend to keep that completely separate, that it's a private life, a private aspect of their life that they don't normally engage in with friends along and with, within an existing friendship group. It can be quite different. And that might be part of the reason why now, like you say, people react very differently to the approach of a stranger in a bar, because they're thinking, no, my romantic life, I organize it through my phone and I keep that separate from my social life, which I'm enjoying now. Thank you. So please stop disturbing me. And so, that again is a very big change. The other thing that I've heard from some people on the site is that they've got into the habit of not engaging with somebody through the apps, that as soon as possible, if they think there's a match, that they will try to meet that person in real life. Because if you start texting and, back and forth and banter online, that those limerent, urges begin to stir, because you're getting a sense of their personality from their voice, their writing voice, and you start to
that
project.
can be faked as well,
and it can be fake, yeah. And that when you then meet that person in real life, it's very disappointing, because they're not like the version of them that you'd created in your mind.
For sure.
And so again, people say try and get into real life as soon as you can. And the other big factor is that we make very different decisions, with somebody in front of us compared to a picture of somebody, in terms of literally, ranking the attractiveness of a person. So there have been studies on this where, ranking attractiveness is very different for a photo compared to, meeting somebody face to face. And you never even get to the opportunity to meet somebody face to face if you're swiping. I don't know if it's swiping.
I imagine it
Fortunately,
gets...
I've never used these apps,
no, goodness, that sounds away. Like hell. But gosh, we both sound very smug here. It's just like, oh, thank God we don't have to do that.
I count my blessings that those days are in my past.
Especially when, because I'm sure that some of people listening, have those apps and they're experiencing those apps, and when they don't get all those different signals, like olfactory signals, like smell is such a powerful signifier to even genetic compatibility.
Sure.
People theorize, and I remember watching this lady who's a couples counselor, and she said that there's like a couple telltale signs that I know the marriage is over before it's even thing, when they say that they get turned off by the person's smell.
Oh yeah, no.
And that is like, there's no turning back from that. No. And for those things,
bringing it back to what you were talking about ovulation, there's been some evidence that the use of the pill, the contraceptive pill, changes the olfactory functioning. And so when women come off the pill,
they said, yes, I've heard that's so sad.
They are not so attracted to the smell of their partner.
That's so sad.
That's rough.
But I was thinking how the fact that you mentioned this person who was saying you have to meet them as quickly as possible on those apps, right? But when the sheer volume of it, the sheer volume of matches, the kind of regular, reasonably attractive person will go in and like straight off the bat get like 50 matches, for example, right?
Mm.
And they try to meet all those people, and they meet them in person, and it's like, okay, this doesn't smell right. Okay, this is not. So they don't look like a picture. It's like, and like by the 10th, quick coffee date, you become jaded.
Yeah.
I imagine you become really, really jaded. And that's also what I've observed in people who are on those apps. Like they just stop even seeing those potential matches as people to an extent.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it is almost the perfect marketization of love, isn't it? That it is
Mm.
literally turning it into a meat market. We used to say that when I was young about nightclubs. That certain nightclubs
Mm.
had a reputation that was just where people were going, and they just wanted to hook up, and that was the whole purpose of being there. But that really is what the apps are like, and I think there's going to be lots of social consequences. I think again, it's not an easy topic to discuss necessarily, but the experience for men and women on the apps is very different as well.
Mm.
That men get jaded because they get rejected. They just get an avalanche of rejections that they very, very rarely match. Women get jaded because every man just matches, matches, and approaches them in a very crude way. Often, generally speaking, they're
Mm.
just completely, um,
Yeah, but
totally
how does that,
superficial.
so how does that sense of being jaded work into limerence?
Yeah, that's a good question as well. I don't know. Would that desensitize you to limerence as well? That's a really good question. If if
Next
you've
study.
gone through that, if you've gone through that process of getting desensitized or getting jaded, would you no longer get that thrill of excitement? I don't know. I think if you met somebody that caused the glimmer in you, you'd still feel it, and
Mm.
you'd still bond. And again, this is another thing that people talk about a lot, is that they maybe meet somebody on an app, and to them it feels like a really good match, and they're really excited about it, and they want to follow up, but they just get ghosted because the other person's just moved on, swiped to
Mm.
the next person.
That should be
And
good
so,
for limerence, isn't it? Because they get very, you get
yeah,
blocked. That's doesn't get much clearer
well,
than that, does it?
no, yeah, that's true. But again, flip it the other way and say, well, if you actually did end up hooking up, well, that proves that that person definitely was attracted to you. And then you've got the complicating factor of, you know, sexual intimacy being a very powerful drive for bonding.
Mm.
So that's another change socially, that it used to be you got to know somebody, in a social way before you got intimate with them. That was a later stage in the dating process. Now it seems to have shifted to being much earlier on. Let's check our sexual compatibility and then see if there's a long-term relationship here. And so again, inverting that means that you're getting that huge release of oxytocin and vasopressin, all those bonding hormones, and all that lovely reward fairly early on in the process. And for a limerent, that's going to drive them deeper into that sense of that altered state of mind of limerence. But then the other person may not have experienced any of that, and for them it was just casual, and they move on. And so the limerent is stuck and presumably still wanting to reconnect with that person, and that other person might be fine to reconnect from time to time when they feel like it. And so then again, you've got this dynamic of hope and uncertainty that isn't getting resolved properly.
And
Yeah.
on that very optimistic note,
Yeah,
I
it's
have
not all
so
doom
many
and
more
gloom. Yeah,
questions, but I think we're out of time.
sure.
Thank you so much for this interview, and everyone. I'll link to SMITTEN in the description under the episode. Definitely check it out if you
Yeah.
want to figure out if your approach to love verges on pathological.
Yeah. So yeah, the book is out on April the 8th, but pre-orders are open. So yeah, if you want to know more about the neuroscience behind all of this and the implications of limerent versus non-limerent love, then that's the place where it's all laid out.
Thank you. Thank you for watching the video. Click like and subscribe if you would like more. It really helps the channel. Thank you and see you next week.